This project is a project that's very different from Wesley. It's a project that's at the other end of town. It's very much in the high-rise sort of solid street walls of the sort of more commercial end of the city, and it's the Equity Chambers building. The building was constructed in 1931, and what's interesting about the building is that from a Heritage Victoria point of view, it's identified as being significant for its architectural presentation, if you like, and also historical. And in an adaptive reuse sense and in the sense of renewal, one of the key issues here was historical significance as one of the oldest barristers' chambers still occupied and operating at the time. And that was a really interesting tension in that this project is very much about adaptation, new build development, as much as it is about conservation. The site also had a fascinating prehistory. It was the site of the earliest synagogue in Melbourne, and we found archaeological remains of the synagogue as part of the process. But probably critically, the date that is key here is 2008, because in 2008, a permit was approved by Melbourne City Council before the building was put on the Heritage Register, which allowed for demolition of the rear of the building and construction of a tower behind it. So there'd been a preemptive proposition, we weren't involved in that, of construction behind a retained facade effectively. I think that in a planning sense, the elements of great significance were really the ground plane, the ground floor, which had a mercantile chamber in the center of it, much like AMP, Bank of Australasia, the CBC Bank, all of the great 30s banking facilities, mercantile facilities with these huge public spaces internally, a narrow entry, and then upstairs, barristers' chambers set up with virtually all of the offices intact. Won the Street Architecture Award medal in the 1930s, Oakley Parkes, this rather interesting mixture of modernity with this layering of Mediterranean sort of flourishes, a bit like Harry Norris. So it's a really quirky sort of Oakley Parkes building. Well recorded and documented. The mercantile chamber, as I say, the major space within the building, and part of the conservation challenge was, and the adaptation challenge, how to retain this space, build above it. Good documentation historically. The Bates solution to this, and in a Bates way, a very elegant response, quite restrained, classical in their sort of derivation of their built form. And this setback of 7 meters. So this was about a facade retention, but with a depth of building retained structurally, and critically with the Little Queen Street sidewall retained, which really held the three-dimensional quality and does in the delivered project. You can see here in the section, basically 7 meters from the parapet, and then there is structure within the building that holds the front. So the front was fully retained for that depth on the grid, and the ground level was retained, including the main mercantile chamber, and then reconstruction above, and 6 floors added at that point. The layout, hotel adaptation, focus in the conservation on very much retention, restoration of the front depth of the building, and in holding and rediscovering, in effect, the mercantile chamber. And so major bit of work to uncover what had been largely ruined in later works. And then the adaptation moving up the building. I won't dwell on plans. Critically, on the first floor, though, what occurred was retention and adaptation of the main chamber spaces, offices, and then the reinstatement of this central corridor and the idea of the barristers' chambers, so that the barristers' chambers weren't retained in total because the building was being adapted, but a key part of Heritage Victoria's requirements was adaptation. This is just to show the level of detail of holding the Little Queen Street facade, an enormously meticulous process of saying we want this as a presentational facade, because the entry of the hotel is Little Queen Street, but we wanted the three-dimensional quality retained in the adaptation. Again, major detailed documentation of elements of the building. The outcome is one where I think in the standing in Burke Street, because of the solid street wall, the setback new build is restrained, recessive. I think it delivers in the way that we'd anticipated in applying for the permits, and allows the jewel-like quality of Oakley and Parkes building very much to remain prominent and dominant in a streetscape sense. So this was very heritage urban design driven as an outcome. Interiors, the front, as I say, a pretty meticulous conservation. The use of the main chamber, it was retrieved. It had been built in, mezzanines had been occupied. Bates did a terrific job in really rediscovering and being guided by our team on revealing this sort of taking out walls that have been infilled. So turning it into the principal space of the hotel, but in a way that was reminiscent of the original mercantile space. Again, detailed conservation works through the building. The building had been tragically, absolutely vandalized and trashed. It was entirely intact internally. And between 2008 and 2018, when this project began, it had 3 owners. One of them absolutely neglected it. It was occupied by squatters and they stole every bit of copper in the place. So we literally had to reconstruct every detail in the building, and this is the process that was gone through. So it was a balance between a very meticulous bit of reconstructing missing elements to hold that 7 meters and then the adaptation. And that went to joinery, paneling, internals, process you'd expect. On the left there is the corridor and the barristers' chambers as it was, and you'll see in a moment, this is the mercantile space. So with the revealing of paintwork, things like this, so that it contains all the evidence. If you want to and have an interest, you can go in and look at what it was like. It's been opened up and revealed. And this is the barristers, one of the floors where the chamber's been reconstructed in the presentation. There was always a tension here for Heritage Victoria because they came on board, registered the building after it had an initial approval. It was managing expectations and deliverables in the adaptive reuse to accommodate an incredibly complicated usual layering of compliances, etc., widths of corridors, materials, all of those issues, but to achieve the ability for someone to walk in and understand the nature of the original space. It has interpretation that occurs within it as well. And so I think that in an adaptive reuse sense, this is a project that I think achieved a good balance. It was, in a central city context, sufficient depth of building retained, a very careful conservation of what was retained and interpretation of it internally, and then the accommodation of a 6-story addition and then an 18-story addition right to the rear of the site. And so that I think it delivers, in what is always a challenging situation, a good balance of adaptive reuse, retention, and combining both aspects. So I think that's really the substance of this particular project. I'll stop sharing at that point.